We're going to be in Judges chapters 4 and 5. We'll only just glance at 5, all the actions in chapter 4. Before we get into this, I want to kind of remind us of the scarcity of women in leadership roles in Scripture. Tonight we're in the Old Testament, and there are a few examples of women in leadership roles in the Old Testament, but there are several other examples of how they were kept from leadership roles. Do you remember when Aaron and Miriam stood up to Moses, and the cloud came and covered them up, and God said, I speak to other prophets in dreams and visions, but I speak with Moses face to face. The cloud goes away, and Miriam has leprosy. So Aaron is reprimanded. Miriam gets leprosy. So there's definitely a division between a male who said something to Moses and his sister who said something to him. Now there are some notable exceptions, and Becky and I were in the truck this afternoon running over to see the girls for a minute, and we were kind of running down a list. The ones that I had in mind, there were a couple of them. There's Huldah. How many of you have heard of Huldah? We don't name our girls Huldah in this neighborhood, but Huldah was a great woman of God about the time that King Josiah had his reforms. Remember, Josiah was a very young king. As he grew up, he wanted to renovate the temple. The temple had gone through a long stretch of poor caretakership. They hadn't done a very good job of taking care of it. And so he set aside some money for a renovation, and he sent the guys in, and while they were there, they found a copy of the old scriptures. And he wasn't quite sure what he needed to do with it. So the workers who had found the scroll and Josiah put their heads together, and they said, we need to ask Huldah. Huldah was a prophetess of the Lord at that time. So when you see all the great reforms that Josiah made, at least in part, those were put forward by a woman named Huldah. But she wasn't the king. She wasn't the one whose storyline we're following. She's just kind of mentioned in passing as we look at that passage. So a lot of people don't even know that Huldah existed. But she was an important figure at that point in time in Israel's history. So she was the one that I put forward. And then Becky said, well, what about Queen Esther? Right? She saved the people. She has a whole book named after her. What about, going to have to help me, Naomi and Ruth. What about Ruth? She wasn't necessarily a hero, but she ends up being in the lineage of David, which makes her in the lineage of Christ. So lots of women are prominent in the Old Testament scriptures, but not very many of them are necessarily famous as leaders. In the New Testament, there's one mention of one female with the same title that was used to describe servants of the church in Jerusalem and in Ephesus. She had the title of deacon. She was a deaconess. So we're not sure exactly what Paul meant by that word when he applied it to Phoebe. She's the only one. But she carried the letter from Corinth to Rome on Paul's behalf, and so she's an important person in that regard. And then, of course, there's Aquila and Priscilla. Sometimes Priscilla gets mentioned first. It's Priscilla and Aquila instead of Aquila and Priscilla. They helped to teach Apollos better the ways of Christ. She was a nurturer, at least, in the church. There was a church that met in their house. So she had some level of influence wherever she went as a member of the Lord's church. But again, she's not a writer of a New Testament text. She's not an apostle, right? We had 12 male apostles, no female apostles. But we had those women who followed them around, paid the bills, took care of them from time to time. But the women are not usually seen in places of prominence. All right, said all that to say this. Let's go to Judges chapter 4. This is probably one of my favorite, one or two of the judges. If you'll remember, we talked about Ehud and Shamgar, and Shamgar was not necessarily a judge. He might have been the king of another nation. He might have been a Hittite, but he also struck down 600 Philistines, which was useful to the Israelites, and that's how we end chapter 3. But chapter 4 kind of ignores him and goes back to Ehud. Okay? Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim is what we're going to say. By the way, best advice I've ever heard, I think it was one of my professors at Harding, said, nobody knows how to pronounce it. Just say it like you mean it and keep going. But I just couldn't get that one out. He was at Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. So Ehud is gone. The Israelites go back into idolatry. God allows Sisera and Jabin to have the upper hand over them. And notice his weaponry. I mean, this is in a period of time when there are periods of time when the Israelites just don't have any ironwork at all. Right? So it depends on who is ruling as to who controls the iron industry. This guy has 900 chariots outfitted with iron. That's tough on any battlefield in that time frame. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command, and Deborah also went up with him. Right? So you get the gist of why Deborah becomes so famous. There's not a judge named Barak. We don't have one. We have a judge named Deborah. She was already famous in that area. People were already going to her to be judged. We find out that she is a wife and a mother and a judge over Israel. So she is a very wise, very useful, very strong-willed woman that is leading in Israel at this time. And again, don't think in terms of Deborah as a leader over the entire nation of Israel, but she was a leader at least in those areas where they were being persecuted by Jabin and Sisera. There's a play on words in verses 6 and 7 that you would never see in the English Bible. And I'll warn you in advance, I don't do Hebrew. I took a couple of years of Greek, never took an ounce of Hebrew. My dad took a little Hebrew and told me what it was like, and I never even tried it. So I'm understaffed in the Hebrew department. However, I do read behind some smart people. And what the smart people tell us is that there is a particular word that shows up in both 6 and 7, and the word is masak in the Hebrew, and it means to gather together or to put in place. And so Barak is told to masak the troops of Israel. And at the same time, I think the NIV says lure, that God is going to lure Sisera and his army, but it's the same word. So Barak is in charge of Masak, the children of Israel, and God is in charge of Masak when it comes to the troops of Jabin, so that he can get the right people in the right place so that he can defeat them. So it's not that Jabin and Sisera decide on their own that they're going to go fight against Barak. It's that God puts it in their mind. He leads them into that battle. He does the same thing with the enemy that he tells Barak to do with Israel. Go get together the army, and I'll get theirs, and we'll meet you down at the river. So the passage explains why we don't have a judge named Barak. He really doesn't do anything out of the ordinary. God is going to win the battle for him. God's going to take care of defeating the enemy. And Sisera, the general over the enemy, is not going to be killed by any of the Israelite men at all. How many of you are familiar enough with this story you already know the end of it? Oh, good. This is a wonderful, wonderful story from the Judges. Jabin's commander, Sisera, he shows up with his 900 chariots. Barak comes down off of Mount Tabor with his 10,000 troops. And evidently God intervenes again with weather, right? So the chariots are not going to work as well in a rainstorm. And when we look at the song that Barak and Deborah sing together after the battle, it talks about how God intervened with a rainstorm. So we've had God showering, huge hailstones on the enemy, and now their 900 ironclad chariots are not going to do them any good because they're all going to be bogged down in the rain. So every time you run into chariots against God, if you're going to bring chariots against God's elect, you're either going to end up at the bottom of the Red Sea or you're going to get bogged down in the mud. They're not going to do you a whole lot of good. So here's the unexpected part. Look over at verse 17. Verse 17. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael. Hang on to that name. The wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera, and he said, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' you say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep because he was exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Do you like this woman? See, if she was one of the bad guys, we would hate this woman. But since she's fighting for the good guys, I like Jael. I don't know if I'd want to have her over for dinner, but I like Jael. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. So you have a wonderful victory that is won by basically two women. If Deborah doesn't go, he won't go. So Barak is so afraid of being the leader that he elects Deborah to go and hold his hand. So he goes and he's the leader, but the victory is actually won by this Jael. The first part of her name, is short for Yahweh. El is the Canaanite word for Lord. So it means Yahweh is the Lord. That's what the woman's name means. So if you run into a woman whose name means Yahweh is Lord, don't go to sleep in her tent. That's the best advice that I can give you. Chapter 5 is a victory song. Deborah and Barak get together and they write this song. And the song is basically like a lot of victory songs. They tell the story of how things had gone wrong in Israel, but how God raises up a leader and how they win the battle. But I want us to look all the way over at the end, chapter 5, verse 28. Chapter 5, verse 28. They tell the story of Sisera's mother waiting for him to come home. These are mean folks. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, "Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed?" The wisest of her ladies answered her, "Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, are they not finding and dividing the spoils? A woman or two for each man. Colorful garments as plunder for Sisera. Colorful garments embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck. All of this as plunder." And so her ladies in waiting are all gathered around her saying, he's taking so long because he's gathering together all the neat stuff that he's won in the battle, and there'll be at least 2 girls for every boy. And he got his 2, didn't he? He got Deborah, and he got Jael, and that was the end of him. Verse 31 says, "And so may all your enemies perish, O Lord. But may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in all of its strength." And then the land had peace for 40 years. So we get another generation as Deborah is the judge and Jael is a national hero at this point, that they're able to keep things under control. But again, we don't have very many instances in Scripture where we have a woman who is responsible. Well, here we have 2. We have the woman who is wise, and I don't know how old a woman she was. I don't know how old Jael might have been. But I've always pictured Deborah as kind of the mother figure, the older woman who has things under control and is wise and is sitting in her courtroom, as people come under the tree of Deborah. Even her tree has a name, the tree of Deborah, to ask what she needs to do. And then I see Jael as this, 30-something with just so much vim and vigor and, come on in, let me give you something to drink, let me cover you up, take a nap, and then right through the temple of his head. So these 2 women are great heroines in the history of Israel, and the book of Judges holds on to that history for us. So we don't get to see it very often, but we do get to see it there. So we'll hang on to Gideon for next week. You're probably more familiar with Gideon than you are with Deborah and Jael. However, I'll almost bet you, and you can read in advance and see how many things you see that you didn't learn in Bible class when you were little. Gideon takes a little bit of prodding by the Lord too. He's no Barak. He doesn't have to go beg Deborah to go with him. But he takes at least 4 different signals from God before he finally says, okay, yes, I'll go. So Gideon, he's not a natural born hero. It takes some pushing for him. So if you get around to reading chapter 6, that might be something that would be interesting to you, and we'll talk about it, Lord willing, next week. Any questions or thoughts? No? All right. If there's something we could do for you by way of a public response, we'd love to do that as we stand and sing.
While you wait